it was the Department of State that then headed by Condoleezza Rice, which leaned on Israel to allow Hamas to participate in the election in the Palestinian Authority. Israel, unfortunately, and for all the wrong reasons, acceded to that irrational, detached pressure, and as a result, Hamas won. And the follow-up is exactly what we have on hand today. One should not be surprised. This has been the Department of State erroneous policy from day one. This is also typical of the same Department of State, and now joined by the White House as of 6.5 years ago, considering Hamas a semi-legitimate organization, and certainly considering the parent company of Hamas, much more dangerous than Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, to be fully legitimate in Egypt and throughout the Arab world, hence the close ties with Qatar as well as Turkey and the pressure on Sisi in Egypt to allow Hamas. The attitude towards Hamas by the Department of State also has a lot to do with the overall battle against terrorism, because only those who do not want or cannot connect the dots do not realize the very, very direct connection between the fate of ISIS on one hand and the fate of Hamas on the other hand. And this is where Israel today is actually fighting America's war, or to put it more correctly, fighting the war of Western democracies. We are the beachhead of Western democracies, and the way the war against Hamas will go will determine the fate of very cardinal American interest in the Middle East. It will determine the future of the regime in Egypt. Will it tilt towards the Muslim Brotherhood, or will it remain in the hands of the military clique? Anybody who assumes that the regime of Sisi is a safeguard and it's a fixed reality, Rock of Gibraltar, repeats the error which was committed towards the Mubarak regime, who was never as stable as misperceived by the West. Hamas perceived gains in the battle against Israel would haunt Sisi in Egypt and would provide tailwind to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is trying to topple the Sisi regime. The fate of Hamas will definitely determine the very shaky reality in pro-American Jordan. Pro-American as long as the Hashemites are there. But once the Hashemites are toppled, and it's in the cards, Jordan will become very much anti-American. There is a reason why Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Oman have been subtly very pro-Israel in the battle against Hamas. They have been very anti-Hamas, and this is in a very unsubtle manner. And the reason this has happened has to do again with their realization. Israel is fighting their war, and therefore we are fighting America's war, in addition, obviously, of fighting our own war. And this leads me to today's very, very sorry state of affairs of negotiations in Cairo. Negotiating with Hamas directly, indirectly in Cairo means that some people have not yet realized the notion of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. How many times does Israel, U.S., the West have to be fooled by Hamas to realize that Hamas has never been a partner for negotiation. Hamas has always been a party to be brought to submission through military power. We're talking about negotiation, which is the best thing, the best prize for Hamas. And the goal should have never been ceasefire. The goal should have always been eradication of the infrastructure of fire. And that leads me also to make a comment on two about the issue of the two-state solution. Hamas controls Gaza, but a few days ago, Israel arrested over 90 Hamas terrorists in Judea and Samaria, which were working with Qatar and Turkey and Gaza in an attempt to take over Judea and Samaria. It has been Israeli security military control of Judea, Samaria, which has averted that wrath. But this should send us a signal about reality. This should be a wake-up call. Anybody who supports this delusion of a Palestinian state or the two-state delusion should realize today it's Mahmoud Abbas, tomorrow it can be Hamas's Haniyeh or other very radical Palestinian leaders. Anybody who does not know the reality of Mahmoud Abbas and therefore wrongly assumes that Mahmoud Abbas is a moderate should realize, like any other regime in the Arab Middle East, the Palestinian regime also is tenuous, is provisional, and this is a one-bullet regime. It takes a coup d'etat, it takes a revolt, it takes a military attempt to topple the regime, to change the regime, hence to change the policy, to change the ideology, and this is exactly the prospect of a Palestinian state, let alone the impact of the proposed Palestinian state upon the future of the Hashemites in Jordan. A Palestinian state west of the Jordan River will doom the Hashemites east of the Jordan River. This is understood by any student of Middle East 101 who knows that the classic zero-sum game in the Arab world is the Palestinian versus Hashemite folks in Jordan, east of the Jordan River. And certainly a Palestinian state, even if under Mahmoud Abbas' regime, should haunt vital American interests. There is a reason why Mahmoud Abbas speaks fluent Russian. He is a graduate of KGB courses. He was the go-between the ruthless communist regimes and the PLO during the 1970s and 1980s. He's very close to Moscow, to Beijing, to Tehran, to Pyongyang, North Korea, to Venezuela, and a Palestinian state, whether under PLO or Hamas, would provide the adversaries, enemies of the U.S. with vital access to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean, obviously at the expense of America's interest. And certainly, should there be a Palestinian state, this would be a tailwind to terrorism for the simple reason we have evidence of Palestinians fighting in Iraq, Palestinians fighting in Afghanistan, Palestinians fighting all over the Middle East, part of terrorist groups, and this is nothing new. The Palestinians were the allies of Nazi Germany, they were the allies of the communist bloc, they were the allies of Khomeini, they were the allies of Saddam Hussein, they were the allies of bin Laden, and why should anybody be surprised that to see them close to, again, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, China, and other noble elements of the global community. And last and not least, a Palestinian state certainly would reward a regime which has driven Christian Arabs away from the area, whether it's Bethlehem or Beit Jalla, Ramallah, Beit Sahur. Those used to be communities with majority of them Christian. Today, tiny, and reduced. Christian minority reduced by the day. Why should such a regime be rewarded by the so-called Christian world? And last and not least, a Palestinian state would also provide the anti-U.S. bloc with another vote at the UN. One more comment which I would like to make on the current war in Gaza. This should put to rest the claim that land doesn't mean much during the era of sophisticated combat planes and missiles. We have had Israelis and Western policymakers and military so-called specialists telling us that who needs the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, which are the Golan Heights of Jerusalem and the coastal plain and Ben Gurion Airport and Tel Aviv. Who needs that at a time when planes and missiles fly over those mountain ridges? Well, one of the many lessons of the war in Gaza has been that, with all due respect to Air Force cannot take care of ground problems as effectively as ground forces. The Air Force did not destroy the tunnels in Gaza. The Air Force could not get to the missile launchers, underground launchers in Gaza. The Air Force could not take care of Hamas leadership in the underground headquarters in Gaza. In order to do all that, it is required to have effective ground forces. And whenever you have ground forces, you also need to have ground elements or high grounds. And this is exactly what Judea and Samaria means for Israel. It's not only the cradle of our Jewish history, it's also the most critical ground element, high ground, which secures the coastal plain, the sliver along the Mediterranean. I would like to stop here, and I assume that there are disagreements or questions or opinions which I can relate to.
Yoram, there's been a great deal of articles and columns written about President Obama's response to the war in Gaza and his withholding of pre-positioned armaments that Israel needs to resupply for the war in Gaza. What are the people on the street feeling about the United States in general and President Obama in particular in light of all of these revelations?
Well, I can only talk on behalf of Yoram Ettinger, not on behalf of the people on the street in Israel. And I would say that one should not get overly excited about those mishaps. Fortunately, the U.S. is not a monarchy, and the U.S. does not follow the French presidential system or the Israeli premiership system. The U.S. has a very clear system of checks and balances and separation of powers, and this has been a reality affecting U.S.-Israel relations. All American presidents have pressured Israel, some more and some less. But the relations between the two countries have catapulted beyond imagination, many times in spite of American presidents and always because of the American constituent and their representatives on Capitol Hill. The same thing took place 2 weeks ago, August 1st, Friday, just few hours before departing for the August recess, when the president impressed upon the majority leader to hold the $225 million for Iron Dome hostage by attaching it to the very, very controversial $2.7 billion bill, which has to do with immigration, border security, etc. But it took few telephone calls by very concerned, top-ranking, high-ranking Democratic senators to alert the president that this is not acceptable to the legislators, and within an hour or so, everything changed, and the $225 million were presented, as should have been the case, as a standalone bill, unanimous consent on the Senate side, and all but 8 House members supporting it on the House side. This reflects the reality of the support for Israel on Capitol Hill. The reality is that irrespective of what the White House thinks of Israel, the fact is, and this is also embraced by both chambers and the American people at large, the fact is that by the day, Israel gains in importance as an essential and unique ally of the U.S., expanding American employment, enhancing American research and development, and increasing American exports, while upgrading significantly American national security. Iron Dome is a case to demonstrate it. Iron Dome was developed fully by Israel, funded fully, the development funded fully by Israel. However, there has been an agreement. There is an agreement with the U.S. through Raytheon that the development is shared with Raytheon in return for U.S. funding of much of the cost of the batteries of Iron Dome. However, manufacturing by the day is shifted to the U.S. from Israel. And once export starts, it will be exported from the U.S. And at the same time, the U.S. has gained a very unique technology when it comes to missile defense against short-range missiles, which definitely is enhancing, will further enhance U.S. national security, as well as the national security of U.S. allies, such as South Korea, which is facing identical threats from North Korea, Japan, which could face such threats from China, and also in East Europe, the Czech Republic, Poland, and other countries. This is one of many such examples, which also spread into the commercial market. Increasingly, Israel is a major pipeline through which cutting-edge technologies are transferred from research and development hubs in Israel to the American high-tech company. That's the reason. Well over 200 American high-tech giants do have research and development centers in Israel. For this and many other reasons, in my mind, one should not get the wrong impression about an attempt by the administration to delay shipment, to prevent shipment, or to forestall U.S.-Israel cooperation. Prime Minister Shamir and President Bush had much worse relations than the current relations between Netanyahu and Obama. But guess what? During Prime Minister Shamir's time, cooperation with the U.S. surged to unprecedented level. Clear thinking Americans do not seek a popular prime minister. They seek a prime minister which can defy the odds, which can defy pressure, and which is driven by principles irrespective of any pressure. From Ben-Gurion through Shamir, those were the prime ministers of Israel. Hopefully, those are going to be the prime minister of the future as well. Well, there's no doubt in my mind that this is a combination of two elements. One element is the power of wishful thinking over reality, and the attempt to subordinate reality to wishful thinking, sometimes at all cost. And this has basically been, in my mind, the story of the Oslo state of mind, starting with Israel and continuing also to Washington and other Western capitals. At the same time, one should not underestimate the ignorance of the Middle East. We have had a series of very significant precedents. Why would the U.S. Department of State assume back in 1948 that the Jewish leadership in the newly born state of Israel would be pro-communist? Under their gullible assumption, the fact that Ben-Gurion was born in Poland suggested that he would be pro-communist. Why would the Department of State assume that appeasing Egyptian President Nasser in the 50s would drive him away from the Soviet Union, while in fact it only drove him closer and closer to the folds of the communist bloc? Why would the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, White House and Department of State, assume that Saddam Hussein, the enemy of my enemy Iran, is my friend, and in fact collaborating with Saddam Hussein literally until the day of the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam in August of 1990. Until that day, there was an intelligence sharing agreement between the U.S. and Saddam. Saddam received dual-use systems which Israel would not receive from the Bush-Baker administration. Bush-Baker refused to provide Shamir with guarantees for loans essential to absorb the Soviet olim those days, but Saddam Hussein was privy to $5 billion loan guarantees, and then guess what? Saddam Hussein revealed himself as an enemy of the U.S., invading Kuwait and attempting to go on into Saudi Arabia. And certainly, why would the U.S. Support the old men in Paris who, according to then Jimmy Carter, Cyrus Vance, Ramsey Clark, Andy Young at the UN, was simply vying for civil rights, for human liberties in Iran, and at the same time stabbing the Shah, the most important ally of the U.S. In the Middle East, stabbing him in the back. And it was the U.S. which facilitated the transformation of Iran from number one ally of the U.S. to number one threat to the U.S. and the free world at large. And there were many, many other such examples, as I mentioned before, the pressure to allow Hamas to run. So we're talking about deep level of ignorance about the Middle East at large, together with the attempt to provide room for wishful thinking at the expense of reality. And I'm always reminded of what I learned when I was Consul General in Houston, Texas, and I used to tune in to country western music. Randy Travis, some of you may be familiar with the name, used to be one of the great country western singers those days in the late 80s, early 90s, and he had a song, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona, and if you'll buy that, I'll throw the Golden Gate in for free. And too many times I think that people from the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., and I admit also in Israel, are too eager to buy that oceanfront property in Arizona without proper due diligence. Well, this is the third war in the last 5 years, and one should make up one's mind. Do we want to learn from history by repeating or by avoiding past mistakes? And one of the past mistakes was the illusion or the delusion that we're talking about a partner, and a partner which is impacted by world opinion, by the U.S., by sound reasoning, etc. There's only one thing that will stop missiles haunting Israel, and that is the destruction of the infrastructure of missile, namely the destruction of the manufacturing facilities, the destruction of the launching facilities, the destruction of the inventories. All of them, by the way, are underground, but most importantly, the destruction of the head of the snake. And that means the destruction primarily of the ideological and political leadership of Hamas, and only then, the less important operational leadership of Hamas. Until that step is undertaken, we only will play into the hands of Hamas, assuming that we are talking about another exercise in the Western world. One thing we should learn from many years in the Middle East, not only the last 100 years of the struggle between the Jewish people and the Arabs over the sovereignty of a Jewish state in the area, but if you study the last 1400 years in the Middle East, is that the Arabs in the Middle East do not use the same dictionary that we do in the Western world. Peace has very different meaning. Ceasefire has very different meaning. And by the way, usually not only different, but opposing meaning. Ceasefire, for instance, is signed many times by Muslims whenever they feel that they need to reinforce their ranks. But ceasefire, according to Islamic dictionary, is by definition and commanded so to be provisional, to be tenuous, and to be broken the minute the Muslim Arab side feels superior. This has been the story of the Middle East. And last and not least, the whole notion of concluding an agreement with Hamas as if we have been absent AWOL during the last 3-4 years of the Arab tsunami. The Arab tsunami has many lessons in store, but one of them has to do with the fate of intra-Muslim, intra-Arab agreements and covenants and treaties. All of them, not only in the last 3 or 4 years, but throughout the last 1400 years, they are written on ice, not carved in stone. And until we understand that, until we realize that, we'll keep making mistakes, paying very heavy price for an agreement which by definition is as tenuous as the regime which signs it, as tenuous as the policy which directs it. One comment to the previous person from Kansas City, and this has to do with Fort Leavenworth. I met a few months ago a former commandant of the U.S. Marines who told me that in Fort Leavenworth, as you probably know, is the intellectual mecca of the U.S. Army, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In Fort Leavenworth, the Army formulate battle tactics. And to quote the former commandant of the U.S. Marines, our battle tactics in the U.S. are formulated in accordance with the Israeli book. And he himself told me he fought in the first Gulf War in Iraq in accordance with Israeli tactics during the 1973 war, which were studied by the army, which were presented by veterans of the Israeli military. And maybe most relevant to today's battles in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and who knows where next, urban warfare, which is today being taught in on different American bases, is fully developed, also trained by Israeli experts. Once a year, major American elements involved in formulation of battle tactics for the American army do get training here in Israel in a special installation which was built especially for Americans, and in few Marine Forces bases there are models which are the site for such training. They're built by Israelis, and Israeli trainers come occasionally to add their experience in order to enhance the fighting capabilities of the American army. Well, as far as I'm concerned, again, I only talk about myself. As far as I'm concerned, the goal must be, and this, by the way, was proclaimed on the first day of the war, must be an end to the capabilities of launching missiles, mortars at Israel. Later on, a goal was added, and which has to do with the tunnels, but that was not the original goal. And once again, there is no way but through ground forces to achieve that goal. You can bomb those targets as much as you want by air, but you cannot destroy them until you enter with ground forces. The idea that ground forces in Gaza would entail Israeli losses is obvious, but for Israel or friends of Israel to assert that we are not willing to pay such a price is the best tailwind to the terrorists. Because in our neighborhood, and increasingly throughout the world, but definitely in our neighborhood here in the Middle East, part of the monthly rental has to be the willingness to pay a price. And if Israel is to upgrade its posture of deterrence, we must spread the notion that we are willing to pay any, and I underline any price, for the achievement of the top goal, which means the annihilation, the destruction of the infrastructures of Hamas firepower. As long as they assume that we are not willing to pay a high price, they do not consider our posture of deterrence as an effective element. Without effective posture of deterrence, not only are we to fail to achieve our goals, but without an effective posture of deterrence, we may even forfeit our capabilities to exist in the Middle East. Well, I can talk about my terrain here in Israel. There is no doubt that during the last 6 weeks or so since the current war started, there has been a shift in public opinion in Israel. The center has moved slightly to the right. The left has moved slightly to the center. We can see it through the anchor men and women of our TV stations. We have 3 Hebrew TV stations which are Dove, more dovish, and extremely dovish. But in the last 6 weeks or so, they have moved substantially to the center. When you are in close contact with reality, you tend to weaken your embrace of wishful thinking. And therefore, I do trust the power of education, the power of encountering realism, but we need to also realize that we're not talking about an educational race which is a sprint, but it's a marathon, probably well beyond our own life span. Anybody who expects some people in the Department of State or the New York Times or Washington Post or MSNBC or CNN to change their positions substantially because of being exposed to reality is not realistic. It may happen, but over very long time. And in the meantime, those of us who are in touch with reality should simply double up their educational efforts and roll up our sleeves even higher for a simple reason. Too much is at stake. It's not only the survival of the Jewish state. We are talking about very critical, vital American interests. There should be no illusion. Anybody who pressures Israel to be more lenient on Hamas is bringing Islamic terrorism closer to the mainland in the USA. Being lenient on Hamas sends a message throughout the Middle East, emboldening all Islamic terrorists, and that includes also the few hundred sleeper cells in the USA. Certainly, it has to do with homeland security in Europe, which is already extremely fragile, and therefore any stepped up educational effort on the part of the so-called realists has to do with day-to-day homeland security in the U.S. as well as in Israel. My proposal has to do with something which I at least have chosen to do throughout my public involvement over the last 40 years, and this is to stick to the truth. This is the essence of this occasion, EMET. This is what EMET stands for. Sometimes they say, well, it's right against left. No, it's right against wrong. It's truth against misrepresentation. And certainly it has to do with the Palestinian issue. Unfortunately, since 1992, 1993, the Oslo state of mind has taken over too many policymakers in Israel and in the USA, and as a result, truth has been pushed to the back seat, overtaken by wishful thinking and misrepresentation. The notion that there are Palestinian rights starts with the name Palestine, Palestina. Palestina is not an Arab name, nothing to do with Islam. Palestina was the name chosen by Adrianus, the Roman emperor, who subdued the Jewish revolt of Bar Kokhba in the year 136, and his aim was to eradicate Judaism from the face of the earth. And part of it was to rename Judea Syria Palestina. And why Palestina? Palestina because of the Philistines. And who were the Philistines? They were Greek tribes from the Aegean islands who emigrated or immigrated to the southern coast of the land of Israel and became vicious enemies of the Jewish people, but nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with the Arabs, and all BS about Palestinians have been here for generations, for centuries, for millennia, has nothing to do with the reality. It has to do with the whole notion of Palestinian refugees. We hear millions and millions. Well, if you go back to the data of 1948, 49, and you do go through simple accounting process. I was in my very far past CPA. I was certified in California, and if you do a simple accounting process, you find out that there were something between 300 to 350,000 Arab refugees as a result of the 1948-49 war. Obviously, none of them is alive today, or very few are alive today. But that does not interfere with the UN Relief and Work Agency, with the Arab world, and therefore with the Western world to talk about millions of refugees. And unfortunately, since 92, the end of the Shamir term in Israel, no Israeli prime minister has ever set the record straight. It has to do with the notion of the Palestinian issue. Supposedly, if you tune in to President Obama, to Secretary John Kerry, to European leaders, this is supposed to be a root cause of Middle East turbulence. And they don't pay attention to the Arab tsunami of the last 4 years, which proves again and again, punctuates the fact of life in the Middle East, that the Palestinian issue has not played any role in any of the events which have triggered the Arab tsunami. Palestinian issue has never been an NBA league, a professional league of Middle East developments, always a summer league, little boys league, etc. We keep hearing from major policymakers that the Palestinian issue is the crown jewel of Arab policymakers. So here we have an Israeli war against the Palestinians in Gaza, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, the Emirates, Egypt side subtly, but they side with Israel. One can say, well, but that's Hamas. Those are the bad Palestinians, supposedly. So what about Mahmoud Abbas? How come he gets from the U.S. Some $450 million annually, which is way more than any Arab country? How come that the Arab oil-producing countries do not assist Mahmoud Abbas financially? Saudi Arabia and the UAE just extended a $20 billion financial package to Egypt. But Saudi Arabia extended the Palestinian Authority since '94 until today between $1 and $1.5 billion. Why don't they rescue the Palestinian Authority from their financial predicament? Well, they know something which the West is still not clear about, and they have realized that Palestinians have played a very subversive, terroristic role in inter-Arab, inter-Muslim relations, starting with Egypt in the 50th, through Syria and Jordan during the 60th, Lebanon 70th and 80th, the collaboration with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the rest of them, they do not forgive and they do not forget. And the question is, how come the Palestinian leaders like Mahmoud Abbas get red carpet treatment when they come to Washington, to any Western capital, but when they land in Arab capitals, at best it's a shabby rug. And there are many, many other elements which should be highlighted, but again, fundamentally, we should stick to the truth, to EMET, to reality, and stop trying to appease and concede and retreat and be so-called moderate. We have a clear case, we have a good case, and again, too much is at stake. Well, Turkey used to be, until the ascension of Erdogan to power, a major element in NATO, a major super ally of the U.S., and a very intimate ally of Israel. The ascension to Erdogan changed everything in a dramatic manner. Erdogan's worldview, Erdogan's mission is to be the leader of the Muslim world. That, by definition, conflicts with vital American interests, with vital Western interests, and with the stability of the region. Erdogan is a Muslim Brotherhood leader. Erdogan sides with the Muslim Brotherhood. Anybody who studies the Muslim Brotherhood, we're talking about a terrorist organization. There was a reason why Sadat and Mubarak and now Sisi have outlawed Muslim Brotherhood operations in Egypt. There is a reason why Erdogan has supported Islamic terrorist groups throughout the Middle East, unless they harm Turkish interests. And therefore, in my mind, Turkey should not be considered a positive, a constructive element when it comes to advancing stability and American interest in the region. At the same time, however, Turkey still is, and I underline still, because Erdogan was now elected to a new role of president of Turkey. The prime minister is basically a puppet of him, and Erdogan is trying to become an emperor of Turkey, and that could change everything. But as of this moment, there are very strong elements in Turkey who do not go along with Erdogan's philosophy. As a result, for instance, a trade balance between Turkey and Israel has increased in recent years, simultaneously with a very dramatic worsening of Turkish-Israeli strategic geopolitical relations. Trade balance has increased because of very clear needs of Turkey, which can be satisfied most effectively by Israeli products. How long will that continue? I don't know, and certainly I would not gamble on Turkey at this point becoming a venue, a pipeline of natural gas to Europe in view of current Turkish policies. My amateurish assumption is that when it comes to Europe, it is an endemic second nature. It goes back at least 2,000 years, and we have seen it again and again in a very egregious display of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel demonstrations. Jews were not expelled only from Spain; they were also expelled from Britain, for example. When it comes to educating Europeans on the damage to Europe, once again, this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And on one hand, one could and or should expect Europeans to wake up to that reality in view of the Muslim expansion inside Europe, in view of the rising threat of Islamic terrorism inside Europe, in view of the demographic avalanche, Muslim demographic avalanche, which has afflicted Europe. But at the same time, the reaction so far may suggest that the Europeans are going through suspension of disbelief, or maybe through a suicidal process. France, for instance, used to have a French city named Marseille, but Marseille is no longer French. It's a Muslim city. Malmö, who would have thought Sweden, it would happen in Sweden, but Malmö increasingly is becoming Muslim. Brussels, the capital of the European Union, is becoming increasingly Muslim, and as far as I hear, in initial grades in the public school systems, Muslims are already a majority. And therefore, my assumption is that they're going through a suicidal process, and this is definitely something to be noted by the U.S., because what we see in the U.S. today is exactly what we saw in Europe 20 and 30 years ago, and I refer to the very substantial expansion of Muslim communities in the U.S., and one, in my mind, should not take it lightly. There is a plan over there. This is not a haphazard type of reality. This is not a story of individuals coming to the U.S. We are talking about major, substantial effort to produce rapidly very high critical mass of Muslim population in particular states in the Union, in particular areas in those states, and it seems to me that the U.S. would be well advised to study the European experience of the last 30 years when it comes to Islamic immigration and find out what can be done to avert the current reality of Europe being also replicated in the U.S. I, quite frankly, cannot detect any effective pressure points which Obama can activate against Israel. Certainly not between now and November. One does not have to be a great maven in American politics to realize that second-term president with the approval rating of Obama, with a potential predicament of Democrats in the Senate, cannot afford to be overtly anti-Israel between now and November. In addition, we have, again, as I mentioned before, the House and the Senate. And in addition, we have the constituents. In addition, we also have very distinct requirements by the U.S. intelligence community, by the U.S. high-tech community, by the U.S. defense industry, by the U.S. Army, etc., all of which suggest that we're not talking anymore as we used to 30, 40 years ago about a one-way street, U.S. gives, Israel receives. This has become increasingly a two-way street. And by the day, the Israeli car, so to speak, is gaining in importance because, again, of the geostrategic, geopolitical, economic realities of the Middle East, of Israel, and of the USA, and certainly, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, as I mentioned before, this is an issue which has very, very limited effect on Middle East affairs. Even gullible folks in the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. understand that American interests transcend by far the Palestinian issue. American interests have to do with regional concerns, global concern, economic concern, technological concern, and this is where Israel plays a major role, I would say a unique role. We are today we are compared to any ally of the U.S. in Europe or in the Middle East, the only stable and predictable and effective and democratic and unconditional ally of the U.S., which doesn't only have the capabilities, but also have the willpower to exercise those capabilities. This is something very rare, uniquely rare, and this is much more important than the issue of settlements, the issue of Palestinian authority or whatever. And that's the reason why, in spite of the lack of chemistry between Obama and Netanyahu, the strategic cooperation between the U.S. and Israel has reached an all-time high, sometimes in spite of the president. But the reality is that cooperation is expanding while chemistry is pretty sour. And the same thing, by the way, applied to U.S. and Israel during the Ben-Gurion 1948-49 through Shamir 1992. During those years, there was a huge and deep gap between the two administrations. But the cooperation expanded beyond any dream because, again, U.S.-Israel relations transcend by far the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian issue. And the sooner we understand that, the more optimistic we will be, and the more effective we'll be also in educating target audiences in the U.S. as well as in Israel. And again, EMET, Sarah and her associates have been very, very effective, especially on Capitol Hill, but also beyond Capitol Hill.
I cannot thank Ambassador Ettinger enough. He has intellectual honesty, moral and historic clarity that most other leaders on the world scene today lack. He has really been an instrumental force in changing the course of my own life in terms of dedicating my own life to bringing out the EMET and the truth. We at EMET believe that knowledge is power, and the more knowledge you have, the closer you come to the EMET, the truth, and the more powerful you are with your message. That's why EMET tries very hard to bring these sorts of clarion voices to the public at large and to members of Congress. And all of our seminars on Capitol Hill and many of our telephone seminars cost us a great deal of money. We do this on a shoestring budget. So if anybody could please help us out, you could go to our website at www.emetonline, that's EMET online, it's one word, .org, and please pledge whatever you can comfortably afford to give us so that we could continue to be in operation. All of us are privileged today to hear Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. He is a profile in courage, and this is like a breath of fresh air to have people on our phone conferences who remind us of what this is all about. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Yoram.
Thank you.